Time's wheel runs back or stops, potter and clay endure. Robert Browning. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. I'd like to thank everyone for joining me this week, and I hope that you, if you're a first-time listener, that you enjoy and will continue to listen and go back through our backlog. Or if you're obviously a returning listener, I hope you enjoy and continue to do so. So, I didn't have too much feedback from last week, although I did have someone point out that technically Korea and Japan are East Asian, and I did say that we were kind of concluding on that last week. And that is correct. They're obviously widely part of East Asia, but I was thinking more in terms of mainland and also where they are culturally as of our current time period, so 8,000 to 6,000 BC, BCE. So a little bit different, at least at this point in time, although, again, yes, in modern times, they are certainly very much aligned to East Asia. But, you know, that's kind of obviously what we're going to be talking about this week. So we're going to go ahead and dive into what is now the countries of Japan and Korea, as well as a few of the people living to the north of the Great Paektu Mountains, which are the mountains of they kind of form the border of Korea and North Korea and China and Russia. And yes, there is a North and South Korea as well. I did kind of misspoke. Maybe I should say the countries of the Korean Peninsula in Japan. So, when last we talked about DNA, last week's episode essentially, of the various Asian groups, I mentioned a group that Melinda Yang referred to as the Amur ancestry. And this refers to the Amur River, which flows through Siberia and Mongolia. And this group spread all across what is now, Mongolia, parts of Russia's far east and China's north. And the other groups she mentioned that I didn't talk about last week are the Jomon, Paleo-Siberian, the Basal ancestries, and ancient Northern Siberian. All four of these groups contributed to the peoples we will be focusing on for the remainder of Asia this season. And we will start with the Jomon and their neighbors and probably their cousins or sibling cultures known as the Jeulmun of the Korean Peninsula. Now, I know I mentioned the Jomon last season because at 10,000 BC, the Jomon were in their incipient phase. But I don't believe I mentioned much about the Korean Peninsula other than broadly, or I may have mentioned the Jeulmun specifically because their cultural material hadn't really emerged yet, but I don't believe I really talked about them very much. But Jeulmun is the Korean word for comb patterned. This is one of the primary designs of early Neolithic sites in Korea, Japan, and parts of the Eurasian steppe and northeast China. It's a very similar type of pattern that I talked about when talking about the Jeulmun cultures in our final Neolithic China episode. It's an old pattern. It was probably in use by most, if not all, the peoples living in the areas that included, that includes the Paleolithic groups who, remember, in this part of the world, developed pottery while they were all still very highly mobile hunter-gatherers. And I should also point out something that I haven't made particularly clear, at least in my opinion, and I'm sure people have picked up on it, but patterns on pottery are not the only factor used to identify a culture. Size, shape, what they were used for, ratio of, the ingredients or the makeup of the pottery themselves, like how much water was used to wet the clay, if it was baked, all that kind of things, all factor into what is considered like a culture's pottery, or what makes pottery tools kind of belong to the same culture. Now, a number of sites have been found dating to right around 8,000-ish in the center of the peninsula. And almost all of them are near major river bends or between two rivers. Places like Songdo-ri and Soro-ri. And there have been was found in a place in Korea's southwest called Sinbuk-ri. That was nestled in a kind of a small valley in the mountains, not far from the modern city of Gwangju. But there are tons of lakes, ponds, streams, etc. that can be found near there. And then again, that's like the one place that's not directly on a river or near one. And these are all classified as being in line technologically as other Paleolithic sites in East Asia. Very few, if any, bladelets, a complete reliance on hunting and gathering, but again, with simple pots for cooking nuts and making stews. Because again, a lot of the wild nuts in the area, they're very highly, they have a lot of tannins and things like that that can make humans sick if they're not removed via a cooking process. There is one known Paleolithic site in North Korea. It's right on the Tumen River, which marks the border, I believe, between North Korea and China. Now, it's possible that there are more undiscovered sites in that country. But as you might imagine, archaeological research is not high on their priority list. And even if it was, and they highly publicized it, I would take anything said about those with a very large grain of salt. Though I will say there probably weren't that many people living there near that river for long stretches of time. At least during the periods we're focused on now, with the climate just beginning to stabilize and warm up after the Younger Dryas, the mountains were probably difficult and uncomfortable to live in full time. Of course, this was probably true of some of the sites in the south too, but it wouldn't have been quite as bad. Also, the sea levels were probably still lower, and there was more of a coastal plain to cross into the peninsula, or crossing, so it makes, crossing the mountains or going through the Tumen Valley, probably not something that was done much, if at all, just because, it's easier to get from mainland, what is now China, in the steppe, into the Korean peninsula, and also even just from where, kind of to the north as well, where modern Russia is, you could probably more easily get there too. But that kind of covers the Paleolithic sites. So now we're going to go ahead and move on to the Neolithic sites in the Korean peninsula. Now, at 8000 BC, this includes the very far south of the peninsula, and I should say the southeast of the peninsula, almost between a little range. They occupied between where the modern cities of Ulsan and Bulsan, as well as the island of Jeju. Now, this is the largest island south of the Korean peninsula. If you see a map of South Korea, this island is extremely visible. It's to the west of the Japanese islands of Tsushima. It is essentially the Korean equivalent to Tsushima. Jeju, as a proper noun, refers to the island, and if you try to break it down by characters, it gives you a few different meanings. It could be offering or art, talent, etc. Nothing to do with a place per se. So the name is likely old and a phonosemantic match from an older dialect or language. So, the people who spoke the Jeju dialect there, they probably heard the name as Jeju and just adopted it, or at least something close to Jeju. Now, what language they might have been using that at this point in time we will talk about in the future, but whatever it was probably fairly isolated. Modern Jeju has its own eponymous dialect of Korean that is very different to the other major dialects of Korean today. The island is also where the Jeulmun is believed to have first emerged. Now, between 8,000 and 6,000 BC is considered the incipient Jeulmun period, Jeulmun. This sees the rise in the number of Neolithic type tools, as well as a slow shift to a sedentary lifestyle. Hunting and gathering is still supreme. They are sedentary hunter-gatherers. But there is an increase to a small amount of cultivation of wild plants. Now, this is not true agriculture, but more horticulture and caring for wild fields and sources and stocks. There is no sign anywhere of steps to control or purposely select traits of crops just yet, much less creating fields for these crops to expand, where they'll grow naturally. Fishing also starts to become a much larger part of their diet, and this only increases as time goes on. And it's not just fishing; they're getting shellfish and things like that they're beginning to use. Now, by 6,000 BC, the peninsula definitely has hit its modern shape and borders. That's not really debated too much. There is even some debate it might have been before that it reached that period, but 6,000 is the absolute latest. But it is also possible that, if it has been a slow kind of rising, that there could be some Paleolithic sites or maybe even attempts at Neolithic Jeulmun sites that were kind of subsumed by the rising tides. Now, at the end of our timeline at 6,000, the small kind of portion in the south, in the southeast where Ulsan and Busan are, that has grown. There are more Neolithic sites in that area, and they have even crossed the Nakdong River, which is the major river in the south that kind of cuts through Busan. So they have kind of linked up their settlements and expanded them out, and then crossed the river. So they're expanding their ranges where they're hunting and settling. But there are also some artifacts further north on the east coast. And it's hard to tell from the maps where these are listed because there are no modern names. It's just the coastline and things like that. But it appears to be near the modern city of Gangdong, which is in a small plain near the sea, right in the foothills of the peninsula's eastern mountains. And you also see artifacts dating to this time frame on the opposite side of the peninsula, where the modern cities of Incheon and Seoul are. And looking at their ranges and where they advanced as this culture expands, it's easy to see how reliant and comfortable they are near or on the sea. They don't even really to begin to move inland and occupy the region where those Paleolithic sites were found until around 2000 BC. So this is not something that is a rush. These people are probably very comfortable in the sea. They don't apparently feel the need to move too far inland for a time. And it's possible that they didn't. It's possible that the Paleolithic peoples living up in the mountains maybe were attracted by their more sedentary lifestyle. They may have found it better to live with that period. They may have found the tools and things that the Jeulmun eventually develop, very useful. And it could have been peaceful expansion, or it could have been a mix of, peace and war. But that's stuff for the future that we'll talk about. Now, I would like to talk about who these people were genetically and who they were related to. But that's very hard to do without making some assumptions, which, you know what happens when you make an assumption. You make an ass out of you and me. But for a number of reasons, including soil quality, environment, and just plain bad luck, no usable DNA samples have been found from this period in Korea. In fact, as far as I could tell, the oldest DNA sample I think that they have been able to find and date from Korea comes from their Three Kingdoms period, which is around 1700 years ago, something like that. I think like the 300s AD. So we're talking about the Iron Age and the early, AD, CE period. So a number of migrations and cultural shifts have happened between that time and the Jeulmun period. And it's hard to know when exactly and what exactly caused the DNA to be what it was in that Three Kingdoms period. So, people do have theories on the Jeulmun War, but just be aware that these theories, again, they make a lot of assumptions, and you kind of have to work with what you've got. And, of course, much like China, archaeological finds in Korea themselves are something that is fairly new. That this is something that is just beginning to really take off. Which is something you see all through Asia. That they're getting more interested in their Paleolithic and ancient historical paths. Before writing and things like that. So, one theory is that they were an indigenous group who had been in the peninsula since humans first expanded out of Africa, and that they had moved south and then, after they expanded out of Africa, and then they moved into Asia, and then they followed maybe, instead of going through East Asia and Southeast Asia, they had actually followed along separately along the Tarim Basin and the Tibetan Plateau, and that they were following, large herds and things like that into the peninsula. And then once the Younger Dryas hit, they kind of moved back south and kind of grouped together, and then expanded back out of the peninsula after the climate became more mild. Another theory is that the Jeulmun are a offshoot of the Jomon of Japan. Then there is a theory, and one that I think that makes the most sense, or at least gets the most right, is that the Paleolithic Koreans, Jeulmun and Jomon, are descendants of the first people to come into the region, making them all some type of cousin, cousins, essentially. The Jomon moving into the islands of Japan, further south, had an environment that was a little bit more easy to live and survive in. Of course, as the Younger Dryas ended and the environment becomes more temperate and Korea becomes more livable, the Jeulmun were able to expand much the same way as the Jomon had, except they did it to the north. The people on Jeju were probably always involved at least some small levels, if not more, of trade with the Jomon. And the Jomon, as a people, had vast trade links across all the islands and communities in modern Japan, and also including the ones, that a lot of people don't necessarily think of unless they're experts on the region, like the Ryukyu Islands, the Kuril Islands, and Sakhalin Islands, further to the north, some of which are now Russian. And not to mention, probably, groups along the Kamchatka Peninsula, even that far north. The Jeju, who were involved in these links, recognized that, there were a lot of people to the south and all these other islands, so it might be easier to move to the peninsula and its seacoast because it was a little less occupied. At least that's one of the theories. But But for now, though, I think that's kind of a good point to kind of draw into the Jomon. We will return to them. They're a very long-lasting group. They are dominant in Korea for a while yet longer. And I don't know about their houses just yet. From what I was reading, a lot of the literature kind of had them as more mobile till right around, I think, 5,500 for 5,000 BC. So they may not have developed their homes yet, but their homes are extremely similar to what you will find in the Jomon people, who have, at this point, begun to develop, very distinctive homes, sedentary communities. We are now, or I should say, about 500 years after our current season starts, 7,500. We are out of the incipient Jomon, and we've moved into the initial Jomon phase. So this is something that you do see a very distinct kind of culture rise up. Although it should be pointed out, and I think this is something I have I sometimes make this mistake too, in not pointing out that the Jomon may not have been completely homogeneous, and that's true of a lot of these things. The Jomon could have been a number of different groups that moved into the peninsula over, a couple hundred years at different places, and in different times, and then, occupied different islands and river valleys on those islands, and so on and so forth. And then once they all moved in, then they kind of developed a kind of shared cultural, ethno-linguistic background. And in fact, DNA evidence seems to support that, at least to an extent. Jomon ancestry is listed as one of the primary ancestry groups that Melinda Yang, in her publication that I talked about last week, has laid out. But their finds only show that they found more people in Japan. I believe the oldest ones were found in Kyushu, which is one of Japan's 4 main islands. It's the one that's kind of furthest south. It's the second smallest, or I guess third largest. I think it's slightly bigger than Hokkaido, which is the one far to the north. But that individual dates from around 6,000 BC. But they have found others between that period. So they kind of have a nice little spread in Japan, in the archipelago. You have 8,000 years ago, which is, 2,000 plus 6, that's 8,000 years. So you have some people from that time period, you have some a little bit later, and I think they even have some as young as 1,000 BC. And there is a certain level of genetic overlap between all of these, people they found, and the modern Japanese are descended from these people, at least in part. As we'll talk about in the future, they are not the primary ancestor of the modern Japanese people. I think at most Japanese people would have maybe around 30% Jomon ancestry, if that. That's a large amount, and it's not something that is true for everyone. Some people have more Jomon ancestry than others. And that may not be necessarily because of war and conquest, though I'm sure that was part of it. It's probably because the Jomon people probably did not have huge numbers. They probably had communities of a few thousand at a time, spread all across the archipelago, and then some smaller ones in between the larger ones. So just you had more people moving in later. With rice production, but that's stuff we can all dive into later. But the Jomon, like the Jeulmun, Their name comes from the pottery form. I think the name literally means cord marked as opposed to comb marked, but the designs are very similar. The Jomon in the incipient period, they appear to have a few different designs. I think 4 main ones. They have cord impressions. They have linear comb impressions. They've got like nail impressions. But once you get to the initial Jomon period, you begin to see them kind of experiment more and come up with other types of artistic expression, at least when it comes to their pottery. And again, there is some regional variation that takes place there. Now, the Jomon, they also have a very highly focused society on things like hunting and fishing. Shell middens are, found in all of their locations. I think virtually even the smallest ones have some type of shell middens, and that's where you find a lot of evidence. They found a lot of great artifacts from those middens. But they were also big on fish as well. They did not just hunt shellfish. I think salmon were considered like a really important part of their diet. But that also includes other animals such as deer, boar, and there is some evidence they may have tried their hand at like managing the wild boars. That they may have even gotten some level of domestication, although that is again hard to prove with pigs, but it is a theory. But they also had certain wild plants that they were kind of in that horticultural mindset. Things they have like some type of tubers. I think they're kind of like yams. And there are, of course, a ton of forests on the islands, especially in the south. I think Kyushu even has some tropical areas deep in the south, and maybe Shikoku as well. Shikoku is the smallest of the Japanese main islands. Now, they also have very distinct homes in Jeulmun culture. They're kind of pit dwellings. They would, dig out kind of a circle in the ground, dig it into the earth a couple of feet, and then they would make their flooring and their entrances, and then their homes would be kind of circular, at least floor plan wise, although I think some of their roofing could almost be kind of square into a circle, to kind of have like light and things come through the roof and also leave holes for smoke and the light to come out. And these will only become more elaborate as time goes on. But yeah, so that is the Jomon there. Again, we're in the early Jomon, or I'm sorry, the initial Jomon period, and this period will last for a while longer. The Jomon period is extremely long-lasting in Japan. It even, obviously, it's been around for quite a while. I think even last season, it was a couple of thousand years old. Excuse me. But when we return to Japan next time, we will be in what is the early period, and that's going to see the islands kind of reach kind of just a really great time in terms of environmental conditions. And we'll talk more about that then, and how the Jomon advance in terms of their art styles, as well as the type of plants that they're working with and what they do. But yeah, so I think that's a good place to kind of end for tonight's episode. Little right around 30 minutes. I think that's a pretty good coverage. Next week we will be talking about the peoples living to the north of Japan and Korea and China, right along kind of the Eurasian steppe. And from there, we will kind of cross the entire steppes, and then we'll move to Australia and those places, and then we'll move on to Europe, and then to the Americas. There may be 2 episodes on the steppes. I'm not quite sure just yet. It'll depend on how much I ramble. And then then Australia will probably be 2, 1 to 3, we'll say, just to be safe. And then Europe, I'm not quite sure yet. But it will be, it'll probably be a few more episodes than that. But we're making pretty good progress here. I know I've been kind of stuck in East Asia for a while, but I have been really pleased with what we've been going over. And I did get a little bit of feedback from a couple of episodes ago about Southeast Asia and Vietnam specifically. And I look forward to going over those notes. So I would like to thank one of our listeners, Fong, for sending those documents over to me. I look forward to reviewing them. So I may have a correction episode to do in kind of our little transitional period between season 3 and 4. But we'll get to that in the future. Stitcher, which is one of the apps that the show can be found on. If you are not aware, that is owned, I believe, by SiriusXM, same parent company. They're shutting Stitcher down. I think you can still find the show on Pandora, which is also owned by the same parent company. I don't know why you're shutting one down and not the other, but just be aware, Stitcher will be moving away in August. And I know RSS has already removed it from the metrics, but I believe it is still automatically being uploaded, but that is obviously going to go away. I'm trying to see if there's another service I can start making sure it's loaded on, but I know Stitcher was one of my more popular platforms. Another feature that may be changing, unfortunately, will possibly be YouTube. I've heard rumors that Microsoft is getting rid of their free video editing system that I use, because again, it's not very complicated, my process. I literally just put a logo of my logo up on the screen, and I just run the audio for the duration of I run the picture for the duration of my audio. I just make it all one clip, one scene. And I like that because those videos include automatically captioning them. And the caption's not perfect, but it is something. But I've heard that Microsoft may be doing away with that program. I will try to find a replacement, something that's not expensive or hopefully free that I can find. But in the meantime, I might be having to use RSS's automatic YouTube upload, which will cause it to be delayed slightly on YouTube. I do apologize for the YouTube listeners there, of which there are a few. So that may be changing, but it may also not be. So we'll see. But that's just something to keep an eye on while, for the future. If you have any feedback, like Thong and others, you can reach me at war@revpod@gmail.com. You can also direct message me on Twitter, or you can leave a comment on any of my YouTube videos. I will respond in any of those places. I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope you continue to listen and enjoy. And if you're interested in some more podcasty type comments, I have been streaming the last couple of Mondays. I've been playing kind of a historical game, or pseudo-historical, Far Cry Primal on YouTube. I've been streaming it there. I tried to do a little bit Thursday too, but game kept crashing. I'm not sure if it was what was causing that. I'm hoping it won't happen again tomorrow, but we'll see. Anyway, thank you all for joining me. I hope you will continue to do so, and I hope you have a good rest of your day and a good rest of your week. Thank you all so much. Have a good day. Goodbye.